He didn't own her. That was the lie he told himself every time she walked into his office, handed him a black coffee, and quietly fixed the blood-stained messes of his life. Ilara was just an employee. But when he stood in the rain outside that restaurant, watching her sit across from another man, laughing at a joke that wasn't his, the carefully constructed walls of his sanity collapsed. He didn't just want the man dead. He wanted to burn the whole world down just to keep her warm. The rain hitting the reinforced glass of the corner office sounded like gravel. Leo stood by the window, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his slacks, watching the brake lights bleed into the wet asphalt down on the street. It was 5:45. The city was gridlocked, choking on its own exhaust and desperation. Up here, it was silent. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. It wasn't a knock. People who knocked were afraid, hesitating out in the hall, trying to guess what kind of mood he was in. She never knocked. The longshoremen's union rep called again, Ilara said. Her voice was flat, neutral. It cut through the low-frequency hum of the air conditioning. He wants a sit-down by Thursday, or they strike at Pier 40. Leo didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the crawling traffic. Tell him if he strikes, I'll personally break his kneecaps with a lug wrench. Then we'll see how well he stands on a picket line. I'll tell him you're reviewing the pension allocations and we'll have a revised proposal by Wednesday morning, Ilara replied, the scratch of her fountain pen against thick paper echoing in the quiet room. Leo finally turned. Ilara stood by his desk. She wore a slate-grey blazer, tailored but not tight, and a simple white blouse. Her hair was pulled back into a severe clip at the nape of her neck. No makeup, or at least none he could detect. She didn't look like the women who usually drifted through the periphery of his life, the ones wrapped in silk and designer labels, reeking of expensive perfume and ulterior motives. Ilara looked like an accountant. She looked like exactly what she was, the only mechanism keeping his sprawling, chaotic empire from eating itself alive. Did I say review the pension allocations? Leo asked, his voice dropping an octave. No. You threatened a federal crime over an unsecured phone line, Ilara said. She didn't look up. She kept writing, aligning a stack of shipping manifests with the edge of his leather blotter. I took the liberty of translating. Leo moved toward the desk. He was a large man, built like a prize fighter who had traded the ring for custom Italian suits. He walked with a heavy, deliberate tread. Most people shrank back when he got within 3 feet of them. Ilara didn't even flinch. She just handed him a single sheet of paper. Sign the bottom. It authorizes the transfer for the front company in Delaware. We need it done before the banks close. He took the pen from her hand. Their fingers brushed. Hers were cold. His jaw tightened. He signed the document in a sharp, jagged scrawl and tossed the pen onto the desk. I have the meeting with the capos at 7, Leo said, rolling his shoulders to work out a knot of tension forming at the base of his neck. Carmine is going to bitch about the sanitation contracts. Have the comparative ledgers from last quarter ready. I want to shove the profit margins down his throat before he even starts. Ilara took the signed paper, blew lightly on the ink, and slipped it into a leather folder. The ledgers are already on your desk, top left drawer, tabbed in red. Leo frowned. I need you to walk me through them. Carmine gets slippery with the numbers. You'll have to manage, Ilara said. She closed the folder. She picked up her sleek, black leather tote from the floor. I'm leaving at 6. The silence in the room shifted. It became heavier, denser. Leo stared at her. The words took a moment to process. Ilara didn't leave at 6. Ilara left when he left. Sometimes that was 8 in the evening. Sometimes it was 3 in the morning, after a shipment went sideways and the port authority had to be bribed in the dead of night. She was a fixture of the office, as permanent as the oak desk and the bulletproof glass. "Leaving," Leo repeated. It wasn't a question. It was a failure to comprehend. "Yes." Elara checked a small silver watch on her wrist. "In 12 minutes, to be exact. The meeting is at 7. "I am aware," she said. "The files are prepped. The talking points are highlighted. All you have to do is read the yellow text. If Carmine disputes the fuel surcharges, turn to page 4. It's all there." Leo felt a sudden, irrational spike of irritation. It prickled hot at the back of his neck. "I don't pay you to leave yellow highlights. I pay you to be here." "You pay me to be your executive assistant," Elara corrected smoothly. She stepped back, putting a polite, professional distance between them. "My contracted hours end at 6. I stay late because the job usually requires it. Tonight I have a personal appointment, therefore I am leaving on time." "A personal appointment." He tasted the words. They felt like grit in his mouth. "What appointment?" Elara looked at him. Her eyes were a pale, unremarkable hazel, but right now they held a quiet defiance. "That is why it is called personal, Mr. Rossi." She never called him Leo. It was always Mr. Rossi. It drove him insane, a constant, grating reminder of the boundary she maintained between them. He wanted to press her. He wanted to demand where she was going, who she was seeing. The urge was sudden and violent, a possessive instinct that bypassed logic entirely. He was a man who controlled everything. He dictated the flow of contraband through 3 major ports. He owned police captains. He decided who thrived and who disappeared. He did not accept blind spots. But looking at Elara's impassive face, he knew pushing would only hit a wall. She would quit. She had threatened it once, 3 years ago, when a rival family had sent a thinly veiled threat to the office. She hadn't blinked at the danger. She had simply handed him her resignation, citing a hostile work environment. He had doubled her salary and personally ensured the rival family ceased to exist by the following morning. "Fine," Leo snapped. He turned his back to her, staring at the rain again. "Go, just make sure the door locks behind you." "Good night, Mr. Rossi." He listened to the rhythmic click of her low heels against the hardwood floor. He listened to the heavy door open and then shut. The click of the latch echoed like a gunshot. Suddenly, the massive office felt entirely too empty. By 7:30, the air in the boardroom was thick with expensive cigar smoke and cheap excuses. Leo sat at the head of the long oak table, a glass of amber liquid sweating onto a coaster in front of him. Down the sides of the table sat 5 men. These were his capos, the lieutenants who managed the street-level mechanics of his empire. Usually he tolerated them. Tonight, he wanted to throw every single one of them out the 30th floor window. "I'm telling you, Leo," Carmine said, his thick hands waving in the air, a gold pinky ring catching the dim overhead light. "The waste management contracts are bleeding us. The trucks are breaking down. The dumping fees are up. We're operating at a net loss in the Bronx." Leo stared at Carmine. He saw a man growing fat and lazy on his payroll. He reached down and pulled open the top left drawer of the desk beside him. He pulled out the folder Elara had left. He flipped to the red tab. He stared at the spreadsheet. Elara's neat handwriting populated the margins in black ink. The yellow highlights glared up at him. "According to this," Leo said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that immediately quieted the room. "Maintenance costs on the trucks have decreased by 4% over the last 6 months, yet your reported expenses have increased by 12%. Carmine shifted in his heavy leather chair. Sweat beaded on his upper lip. "Well, you know, it's inflation. Parts are expensive. The mechanics—" "Turn to page 4, Leo said mechanically, echoing Elara's instructions. He flipped the page. Fuel surcharges. You claimed a 20% hike. The city average is 6. Where's the other 14% going, Carmine? Into your wife's casino habit? Carmine went pale. The other men at the table suddenly found their own hands fascinating, refusing to make eye contact. Leo slammed the folder shut. The sound made a younger guy at the end of the table jump. Fix it, Leo said softly, or I will find someone who knows how to do basic math without stealing from me. He dismissed them with a wave of his hand. They scrambled out of the room like rats, abandoning a sinking ship. When the door finally closed, Leo let out a long, ragged breath. He rubbed his temples. A headache was building behind his eyes, a sharp, pulsing pressure. He reached for his glass, then realized he wanted coffee. Black. Bitter. He pushed his chair back and walked out into the bullpen. The outer office was dark, lit only by the emergency lights and the glow of the city through the windows. He walked over to Ilara's desk. It was spotless. The computer monitor was off. The pencils were aligned. He stood there for a moment in the quiet. He didn't know how to work the espresso machine. He owned a multi-million-dollar syndicate. He had authorized hits with a nod of his head, but he had never touched the sleek Italian machine sitting on the counter in the corner. Ilara always did it. She knew the exact ratio of grounds to water. He felt a surge of pathetic helplessness, which immediately morphed into anger. He walked behind her desk and opened her top drawer. He didn't know what he was looking for. A notepad. A clue. Something to explain the sudden, gnawing anxiety chewing at his ribs. The drawer was immaculate. Paperclips in a small magnetic bowl, a spare phone charger, a small black leather notebook. He hesitated. A boundary stood here, invisible but solid. He pushed past it. He picked up the notebook and flipped it open. It was just work notes, cryptic shorthand. Call F regarding shipment. Delay PA payment until Thursday. He flipped toward the back. The writing changed. It became less hurried, more precise. Dry cleaning. Buy cat food. 7:30 p.m. Laura. Leo stared at the final line. 7:30 p.m. Laura. Laura was a restaurant in the West Village. Small, intimate, candlelight and overpriced wine. It wasn't a place you went for a business meeting. It wasn't a place you went alone. It was a place you went when you wanted someone to lean across the table and touch your hand. A personal appointment. He checked his watch. It was 8:15. She was there right now. He dropped the notebook back into the drawer and shoved it shut. The slam echoed in the empty office. A cold, heavy stone dropped into his stomach. Ilara wasn't just his assistant. She was the buffer between him and his own madness. She anticipated his needs before he had them. She knew the worst parts of him, the blood and the brutality, and she never flinched. He had assumed, with the arrogant blindness of a man used to getting exactly what he wanted, that she existed entirely within his orbit, that when she left the office, she simply went into standby mode, waiting until he needed her again. The idea that she had a life that involved sitting in a dim restaurant with someone else, felt like a physical theft. It felt like someone was taking something that belonged to him. He didn't think about it. If he thought about it, he would realize how deranged it was. He just moved. He grabbed his long wool overcoat from the rack. He bypassed the elevator and took the fire stairs down to the private garage, his heavy boots echoing off the concrete walls. His driver, Frank, was leaning against the hood of the armored SUV, smoking a cigarette. Frank took one look at Leo's face, dropped the cigarette, and stamped it out. "Where to, boss?" Frank asked, opening the rear door. "The West Village," Leo said, his voice flat. Dead. Laura, get there fast. Frank didn't ask questions. He slid into the driver's seat and gunned the engine. The ride was a blur of neon and rain. Leo sat in the back, staring out the tinted window. His jaw was clenched so tight, his teeth ached. He told himself he just needed her for work. He told himself Carmine's numbers were a mess, and he couldn't wait until morning to sort it out. He needed her to pull the raw data. That was all. It was a matter of business efficiency. It was a lie, and the acidic burn in his chest proved it. The SUV pulled to a halt at the curb. The rain was coming down harder now, washing the street in a cold, grey sheen. "Wait here," Leo said. He stepped out into the storm. Laura was exactly as he expected. The front was mostly glass, fogged at the edges from the heat inside. Warm, golden light spilled out onto the wet sidewalk, cutting through the miserable night. Leo stood in the shadows just beyond the awning. The collar of his coat turned up against the rain. Water dripped from his hair down his neck, but he didn't feel the cold. He was burning up. He looked through the glass. The restaurant was crowded, a sea of couples leaning in close, drinking wine, laughing softly. It took him 30 seconds to find her. She was sitting in a booth near the back. Leo stopped breathing. It was Ilara. But it wasn't the Ilara he knew. The severe hair clip was gone. Her dark hair fell in soft, loose waves around her shoulders, catching the candlelight. The grey blazer had been replaced by a deep, emerald green dress. It wasn't flashy. It didn't show too much skin, but it draped against her collarbones in a way that made his throat go dry. She was holding a glass of red wine, swirling it slowly, and she was smiling. Not the tight, polite, placating smile she gave him when he was throwing a tantrum over a delayed shipment. It was a real smile. It reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. It made her look younger. It made her look beautiful in a way that punched the breath out of his lungs. Then Leo looked at the reason she was smiling. He was a thoroughly average man. Sandy blonde hair, receding slightly at the temples. A neat, sensible button-down shirt under a navy sweater. He looked like a man who worried about his mortgage rate and spent his weekends at hardware stores. He looked safe. He looked normal. Leo felt a surge of hatred, so pure and intensely concentrated, it made his vision blur. The man said something. Ilara laughed. She threw her head back, a genuine, uninhibited laugh, and her hand moved across the white tablecloth. The man reached out. He placed his hand over hers. He didn't grab it. He just let his fingers rest over her knuckles. A casual, intimate gesture of possession. A metallic taste flooded the back of Leo's throat. His hands, shoved deep in his pockets, curled into fists so tight his fingernails dug half-moons into his palms. The violence in him, the dark, ugly thing he usually kept leashed for his enemies, clawed its way up his throat. He wanted to walk through that door. He wanted to cross the crowded room, grab that sandy-haired civilian by his sensible sweater, and drag him out into the alley. He wanted to break the hand that was currently touching Ilara's skin. He wanted to ruin the man until he was nothing but a cautionary tale, a bloody reminder that you do not touch what belongs to Leo Rossi. Belongs. The word echoed in his skull. She didn't belong to him. She was an employee. She was a civilian. She was a woman who went home at night and lived a life completely detached from the blood money that paid her salary. But as Leo watched the man stroke his thumb across the back of Ilara's hand, the cynical, pragmatic reality of his life burned away. He was a monster. He knew that. He lived in the dark, navigating a world of violence, betrayal, and cold calculation. Ilara was the only clean thing in his life. She was the anchor that kept him tethered to humanity. He had assumed, arrogantly, stupidly, that simply being near her was enough. It wasn't. Seeing her here, bathed in warm light, looking at another man the way she had never looked at him, he realized the terrifying depth of his own greed. He didn't just want her to manage his schedule, he wanted her time. He didn't just want her loyalty, he wanted her devotion. He wanted the soft waves of her hair. He wanted the genuine laugh. He wanted to be the only thing she saw when she closed her eyes. The rain plastered his coat to his back. The cold finally began to seep into his bones, but the fire in his chest only burned hotter. Ilara shifted in her seat. She glanced toward the window. For a second, Leo thought she saw him. He stood perfectly still, a dark silhouette in the downpour, a predator watching from beyond the glass. Her eyes seemed to catch on the shadows where he stood. The smile faltered slightly on her lips. A small frown creased her forehead. She pulled her hand out from under the man's hand to reach for her wine glass. Leo felt a savage, petty thrill of victory at the loss of contact. He didn't go inside. Going inside would mean causing a scene. It would mean exposing the desperate, unhinged jealousy clawing at his insides. Ilara would see him for exactly what he was, a volatile thug who couldn't handle the fact that she had a life. She would hate him. She would leave. And if she left, he knew with absolute, chilling certainty that his empire would crumble and he would go mad in the ruins. He took one last look at the man sitting across from her. He memorized his face, the slope of his nose, the set of his jaw. He memorized him, the way a sniper memorizes a target. Leo turned his back on the warm light and walked back to the waiting SUV. He opened the door and slid into the leather interior. It smelled like rain and cold air. Frank glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Everything okay, boss? Do we need to send a message to somebody in there?" Leo stared at the back of Frank's head. His voice, when he spoke, was entirely devoid of emotion. A flat, terrifying calm. "No," Leo said softly. "Drive." "Back to the office?" "No," Leo replied, looking out the window as Laura disappeared behind them in the rain. "Drive to the waterfront. I need to make a phone call." He wasn't going to drag the man into an alley. He wasn't a street thug anymore. He was a king. Kings didn't brawl in the dirt over a slight. Kings manipulated the board. They moved the pieces. They created circumstances so suffocating, so inevitable, that their enemies destroyed themselves. That man wanted a normal life with Ilara. Leo reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his encrypted phone. He was going to ensure that man's normal life became a waking nightmare. He was going to dismantle his career, ruin his finances, and crush his spirit until he was utterly incapable of looking at a woman like Ilara without feeling profound, crushing shame. He would do it quietly. He would do it seamlessly. And Ilara would never know. She would come to work tomorrow, her severe clip back in place, her hazel eyes focused on his ledgers. She would be mildly disappointed that her date hadn't worked out, that the man had suddenly stopped calling, forced to leave the city under mysterious, crushing debt. And Leo would be there, waiting. He typed a number into the keypad, his thumb hovering over the call button. The screen glowed in the dark of the car, casting harsh shadows across his face. He didn't own her. Not yet. But as the phone began to ring, Leo closed his eyes and let the monstrous truth settle into his bones. He was going to. The dossier lay open on Leo's desk by 7 in the morning. The harsh fluorescent light of his desk lamp cast sharp shadows across the glossy pages. His name was Thomas Hilliard, 34 years old, senior account manager at a mid-tier commercial insurance firm. He had a 780 credit score, a golden retriever mix, and a leased 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was rapidly gentrifying. He went to a generic liberal arts college. He played in a recreational softball league on Thursday nights. He was agonizingly, offensively unremarkable. Leo flipped to the second page, scanning Thomas's financial history. A small student loan, nearly paid off. A decent 401k. No gambling debts. No hidden addictions. No glaring weaknesses that a man like Leo usually exploited. Thomas Hilliard lived a life entirely above board, insulated by the safety of mediocrity. Leo felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. It made him hate the man even more. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 6 months. It rang twice before a voice answered, thick with sleep and immediate apprehension. "Mr. Rossi," the man said. "It's early." "Wake up, Greg," Leo said, his voice a low, soothing rasp. He leaned back in his leather chair, watching the city below begin to wake up in the grey morning light. "I have a favor to ask. The union pension funds we parked in your commercial division last quarter, the ones keeping your liquidity ratios out of the gutter." A heavy pause on the other end of the line. "Yes, we're very grateful for the continued partnership, Leo. Is there a problem?" "Not with the funds, but there is a firm, Hilliard and Associates. They hold a substantial commercial liability portfolio." Leo tapped a heavy silver pen against his desk blotter. "I want their underwriting revoked by Friday." "Oh, I can't just revoke. Greg, look at the balance sheet. Find a discrepancy, a missed filing, a miscalculated risk assessment in their downtown sector. I don't care if you have to manufacture it out of thin air. Pull their backing. If I do that, the firm goes under. It's a localized panic. Hundreds of people—" "I don't care about hundreds of people," Leo interrupted, the coldness in his voice dropping the temperature in the room. "I care about Thomas Hilliard. He's the senior account manager handling that specific portfolio. When the firm collapses, I want the failure pinned squarely on his desk. I want him fired with cause. I want him blacklisted in the industry by Monday." Silence stretched over the line, heavy and suffocating. Greg was a banker, a man who dealt in percentages and margins, not blood. But he understood the currency of power. "It's done," Greg whispered. Leo hung up. He tossed the phone onto the desk. He closed the dossier and shoved it into the bottom drawer, locking it with a heavy brass key. 10 minutes later, the heavy mahogany door clicked open. Elara walked in. She was back in her armor, a charcoal grey suit, tailored sharply at the waist, a crisp white shirt buttoned to her collarbone. Her dark hair was scraped back into the severe, punishing clip, hiding the soft waves he had seen tumbling over her shoulders the night before. She carried 2 black coffees in a cardboard tray. She walked to his desk, set 1 cup down exactly 2 inches from his left hand, and took a step back. "Or good morning," she said. Her voice was the same neutral, unflappable monotone it always was. Leo looked at her. He searched her face for a lingering glow, a soft smile, any residual trace of the woman who had laughed at the boring man in the green dress. There was nothing. She was perfectly, utterly composed. "Morning," Leo replied, picking up the coffee. The heat seeped into his palm. "How was your appointment?" He kept his eyes on his computer screen. He made it sound like an afterthought, a casual inquiry from an indifferent boss. Elara paused. It was a fraction of a second, barely noticeable unless you spent 60 hours a week studying her. Her fingers tightened slightly on the handle of her leather tote. "It was fine," she said. "Thank you for asking. The revised contracts for the sanitation union are on your desk. They conceded the fuel surcharges. Did they? Leo took a sip of the coffee. It was black, bitter, and perfect. Good. Have legal draft the final copies. Already done, she said. She turned and walked toward the door. Leo watched the sharp line of her shoulders. She was his again. She was back in the box, back in the world he controlled. And out there, in the bright, oblivious city, Thomas Hilliard was driving to a job he wouldn't have by the end of the week. "Ilara," Leo called out before she reached the door. She stopped, looking back over her shoulder. "Yes, Mr. Rossi? Cancel my lunch with the mayor's zoning commissioner. Order something in, just for us. We have a lot of numbers to crunch today." Her eyes flicked to his, assessing, reading the subtle shifts in his demand. "Of course. Anything specific?" "Whatever you want," Leo said smoothly. "I trust your taste." By Tuesday of the following week, the silence from Thomas Hilliard had become a physical presence in the office. Leo watched it happen in real time. He watched the way Ilara's phone sat on the corner of her desk, a sleek black rectangle that she usually ignored. Now, her eyes flicked to it every time a notification chimed. Usually, it was just an email. He saw the microscopic tightening of her jaw when the screen went dark again. Thomas had texted her once, on Friday night, a frantic, disjointed message about an emergency audit at work and his life falling apart. He had cancelled their second date, a Saturday afternoon coffee, and then completely vanished. Leo knew this because he paid a private security contractor $10,000 a month to clone the data off the local cell towers. He read the texts on his own encrypted screen while he drank his morning espresso. He read Thomas's panic. He read Ilara's polite, concerned response. "Take care of what you need to. Let me know if I can help." He hadn't replied. Thomas was too busy dealing with the fact that his bank accounts were frozen under suspicion of corporate fraud, a neat little cherry Leo had added to the sundae on Sunday afternoon. Thomas's landlord, a company heavily leveraged by one of Leo's shadow banks, had abruptly terminated his lease due to a sudden renovation clause. Thomas Hilliard was drowning. He didn't have the time or the oxygen to think about a woman he had taken to dinner once. It was 8:30 on a Thursday night. The bullpen was empty. The city lights outside were a smear of yellow and red through the rain-streaked glass. Ilara was still at her desk. She was typing with a rigid, punishing rhythm, inputting shipping manifests from the port of Newark. She had been working 14-hour days all week. She was burying herself in the spreadsheets, using the endless columns of numbers to block out the quiet hum of rejection. Leo walked out of his office. He didn't wear his jacket. His sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, exposing the dark, intricate ink of his tattoos. He carried 2 white porcelain plates and a steaming carton. He walked over to her desk and set a plate down, directly over her keyboard. Ilara stopped typing. She blinked, looking down at the spicy rigatoni. "Eat," Leo commanded. "I have to finish the Newark manifests before the morning shift change," Ilara said, her voice thin. She looked exhausted. There were faint, bruised shadows beneath her eyes. "The manifests can wait. You look like you're going to pass out on my floor, and I don't want the liability." Leo pulled up a rolling chair from an empty cubicle and sat down beside her. He opened the carton and scooped pasta onto her plate, then his own. He had ordered from a small, family-run Italian place in Queens. It was a place Ilara had mentioned exactly once, 2 years ago, in passing. She picked up her fork slowly. She took a bite. She closed her eyes for a brief second, the warm, familiar flavor breaking through the icy wall she had built around herself all week. "Thank you," she murmured. "Don't thank me. I just didn't want to eat alone," Leo lied. He ate a bite of his own food, watching her in his peripheral vision. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't the usual tense, professional silence. It was heavier. It was the silence of two people sitting in a dark room while the rest of the world slept. "You've been here late every night this week," Leo noted casually, leaning back in his chair. "Avoiding going home?" Ilara stiffened. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Just ensuring the quarterly transition goes smoothly, Mr. Rossi. You usually manage to ensure that between the hours of 9 and 6? He turned his head, looking at her directly. The harsh overhead lighting caught the sharp angles of his face, making him look predatory, dangerous, but his voice was remarkably soft. "Did something happen?" She looked down at her plate. A civilian would have cracked. A civilian would have poured their heart out, complained about the guy who ghosted them, sought comfort. Ilara was not a civilian. "No," she said evenly. "Nothing happened. Just a scheduling conflict." "A conflict," Leo repeated. The word tasted like victory. "People are unreliable, Ilara. Out there, in the real world, they flake. They panic at the first sign of pressure. They don't know how to handle anything that isn't handed to them on a silver platter." He leaned in slightly. The scent of his cologne, something dark, woody, and expensive, drifted across the space between them. "You shouldn't waste your time on people who don't understand your value," he said quietly. Ilara finally looked at him. Her hazel eyes met his dark ones. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. The boundaries were blurring. He was her boss, a mafia kingpin, a man who dealt in extortion and murder. But right now, sitting in the dim glow of her computer monitor, bringing her food she loved, he was the only solid thing in her life. She didn't pull away. She stared at him for a long, heavy moment. "And you understand my value, Mr. Rossi?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Leo's gaze dropped to her mouth. It was a microscopic movement, but he knew she caught it. He wanted to reach across the desk. He wanted to pull the clip out of her hair and bury his hands in the dark waves. He wanted to tell her he would burn the city to the ground before he let another man look at her. He restrained himself with a violent internal effort. The cage wasn't locked yet. He couldn't spook her. "I pay you $250,000 a year, Ilara," Leo said, his lips curving into a slow, dangerous smile. "I understand exactly what you are worth." He stood up, taking his plate. "Finish your food. Go home. The manifests will be there tomorrow." He walked back into his office, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. He stood in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. She had looked at him, really looked at him. Thomas Hilliard was a ghost. Leo Ross was the only man left standing. Ilara was not stupid. You do not survive 5 years as the right hand to the head of the most ruthless organized crime syndicate on the Eastern Seaboard by being oblivious. She knew how to read ledgers. She knew how to read people. Most importantly, she knew how to read Leo. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a week and a half since she had last heard from Thomas. The sting of the rejection had dulled into a dull, pragmatic acceptance. It was fine. She didn't have time for a relationship anyway. She was sitting at her desk, processing the weekly invoices from the law firm Leo retained for his legitimate corporate restructuring. It was a tedious job, mostly burying exorbitant retainer fees under vague line items like consultation and market analysis. She clicked through the digital file, her eyes scanning the billing codes. She stopped. She scrolled back up. There, buried on page 14 of a 70-page invoice, was a billing entry for 5 hours of legal drafting. The partner's rate was $1,000 an hour. The client name listed under the blind trust was Delaware Holdings, LLC. That was Leo's favorite shell company. The target of the legal action was listed in the subtext: Hilliard asset liquidation, debt acquisition, and foreclosure facilitation. Elara stared at the screen. The letters seemed to detach from the white background and float in front of her eyes. Hilliard. It was a common enough name, but the date on the billing entry caught her eye. It was last Wednesday, the day after her date, the day Thomas's life had suddenly, violently imploded. A cold wash of dread poured over her skin, starting at the base of her neck and pooling in her stomach. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She bypassed the standard accounting software and logged into the back door terminal she used to track the syndicate's dirty money. She searched the shell company. She pulled the metadata from the law firm's servers. She found the paper trail. She found the aggressive shorting of the insurance firm's stock. She found the leveraged buyout of Thomas's apartment building by a holding company tied to Carmine's crew. She found a recorded transaction, a donation, to a private banking executive named Greg on the very morning after her date at Laura. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a corporate downsizing. It was a targeted, systematic annihilation. Elara sat back in her chair. The office was quiet. The low hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine in her ears. She thought about the way Leo had looked at her the morning after the date. "How was your appointment?" She thought about the spicy rigatoni. People are unreliable, Elara. He hadn't just fired the man. He hadn't just threatened him. He had methodically destroyed every pillar of Thomas Hilliard's life, stripping him of his job, his home, and his reputation, all within a matter of 72 hours. And he had done it with the casual, terrifying ease of a man swatting a fly. Because of her. Because she had sat in a restaurant and let a man touch her hand. A tremor started in her hands. It wasn't fear. She had stood in rooms where men were beaten to a bloody pulp and hadn't blinked. It was fury. A deep, crystalline anger that sharpened her vision until the world looked like cut glass. He thought he owned her. He had constructed an invisible cage around her life, determining who she could see, where she could go, violently excising anyone who stepped over a line he had drawn in his own deranged mind. Elara printed the invoice. She highlighted the line item in a bright neon yellow, the same yellow she used when he was being obtuse about his own profit margins. She picked up the piece of paper. She didn't knock. She opened the heavy mahogany door to his office and stepped inside. Leo was on the phone. He was standing by the window, looking out over the city, a heavy, crystal tumbler of bourbon in his free hand. He glanced over his shoulder as she walked in. He held up a finger, signaling for a minute. "Tell the Russians the port tariffs are non-negotiable," Leo said into the phone, his voice a low gravel. "They pay the percentage, or their crates sit on the dock until they rot. I don't care. Handle it." He hung up, tossing the phone onto the leather sofa. He turned to face her, the tension in his shoulders easing. He offered her a faint, rare smile. "What is it, Elara? You look pale." She walked across the sprawling Persian rug. She didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of his desk, closer than she ever usually stood. The scent of his bourbon and cologne was overwhelming. She placed the piece of paper on the center of his blotter. She smoothed it out with careful, deliberate fingers. Leo looked down at the paper. He saw the yellow highlight. He saw the name. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. His eyes widened slightly, a microscopic flinch of a predator, realizing the trap had snapped backward. But he recovered instantly. His face went blank, an impenetrable wall of cold stone. He didn't look up at her. He stared at the name. "Did you find an error in the billing?" Leo asked. His voice was entirely flat. Too flat. "No error, Mr. Rossi," Ilara said. Her voice was steady, but it carried a lethal, icy edge that she had never directed at him before. Just an interesting line item. Hilliard Asset Liquidation. Leo slowly picked up his tumbler. He took a sip of the bourbon, letting the silence stretch, calculating his next move. He had underestimated her. It was a fatal mistake he rarely made. He had assumed she wouldn't look. He had assumed the firewall was secure. He finally looked up at her. His dark eyes were bottomless, swirling with a dangerous mix of defiance and something deeply possessive. "It's business, Ilara. We acquire distressed assets. That's what we do." "You acquired a mid-level insurance account manager's entire life," Ilara countered, her voice rising just a fraction, the control finally beginning to crack. "You had his bank accounts frozen. You had his lease terminated by a shell company you own. You had him fired. Within 3 days. Leo set the glass down. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal. He leaned forward, resting both hands flat on the desk. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer a corporate excuse. "He was over-leveraged," Leo said softly. "I just sped up the inevitable." "You ruined a man you don't even know." "I know he wasn't good enough for you," Leo snarled. The words ripped out of his throat, raw and violent. The facade of the cool, calculating businessman shattered completely. He pushed away from the desk and stood up, his massive frame dominating the space. He walked around the desk until he was standing inches from her. Ilara didn't step back. She held her ground, tilting her head up to meet his furious gaze. "You don't get to decide that," she hissed. "You don't own me, Leo." It was the first time she had used his first name in 5 years. It hit him like a physical blow. Leo looked down at her, at the fire blazing in her pale hazel eyes. He saw the anger. He saw the betrayal. But beneath it, he saw something else. She wasn't running away. She was standing in the fire with him. He reached out. He didn't grab her. He just raised his hand and let his knuckles brush lightly against the sharp line of her jaw. His hand was trembling slightly. "Don't I?" he whispered, his voice dark, ragged, and entirely devoid of sanity. "Look at what I just did to a man who only held your hand, Ilara. Imagine what I would do to the rest of the world to keep you." The air between them vanished, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying gravity. Ilara stared up at the monster she had served for 5 years, realizing too late that the leash she thought she was holding had been wrapped around her own throat all along. Ilara didn't flinch away from his hand. She didn't slap it away either. She simply stood perfectly still, letting the rough heat of his knuckles rest against her skin, forcing him to feel the steady, unpanicked pulse beating at her jawline. "Imagine what you would do," she repeated. The words were quiet, but they cut through the heavy air of the office like a scalpel. "I don't have to imagine, Leo. I just saw it. You destroyed a man's life because he bought me a glass of wine. What happens if someone actually touches me? What happens if I decide to love someone? Do you burn the city down? Do you start a war?" Leo's thumb shifted, tracing the line of her cheekbone. His eyes were entirely black. "If I have to." "That isn't loyalty," Ilara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "That's a sickness. You think you're protecting me. You think you're claiming me. But all you're doing is putting a gun to my head and calling it affection." She stepped back. The sudden loss of contact made Leo's hand twitch. He let it drop to his side, his fingers curling into a fist. "I have spent 5 years cleaning up your blood, Leo," Ilara said. She turned and walked over to her leather tote, resting on one of the visitor chairs. She picked it up. I have buried your secrets. I have structured your shell companies, and I have kept you out of federal prison. I did it because I respected you, because you were disciplined." She slung the bag over her shoulder. She looked at the man standing in front of the window, a man who commanded an army of killers, a man who was currently vibrating with a barely contained, violent panic. "But you aren't disciplined anymore," Ilara said smoothly. "You're just a thug having a tantrum, and I don't work for thugs." Leo's head snapped up. The air in the room instantly turned lethal. "You aren't leaving." "I am resigning, effective immediately," Ilara said. "I won't accept it. It isn't a negotiation." She walked toward the heavy mahogany door. Every instinct in Leo's body screamed at him to move. He could cross the room in 3 strides. He could grab her arm. He could lock the deadbolt and throw the key out the 30th story window. He could physically trap her in this room, in this building, in his life, until she understood that she was never, ever walking away. But as her hand closed over the brass doorknob, a cold, terrifying clarity pierced through the red haze of his obsession. If he stopped her now, he would have a prisoner. He would look into her hazel eyes and see fear, or worse, contempt. She would become another captive asset. She would never look at him with that quiet, fearless defiance again. The woman he wanted, the woman who challenged him, who stood in the fire and didn't burn, would die the second he turned the lock. "Ilara," Leo said. She paused, her back to him. The door pulled open 3 inches. The sound of the bullpen's air conditioning drifted in. "If you walk out that door," Leo warned, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that scraped against the walls, "there is no severance. There is no letter of recommendation. You are cut off. You step out of my protection." She looked back at him over her shoulder. Her face was an impenetrable mask. "I don't need your protection," she said. "I never did." She stepped through the doorway. The heavy door swung shut. The latch clicked. Leo stood perfectly still for 10 seconds. He listened to the faint, rhythmic sound of her heels on the hardwood floor outside, fading away toward the elevators. He listened until there was absolutely nothing left but the hum of the city through the glass. He looked down at his desk. The piece of paper with the yellow highlight sat perfectly centered on the blotter. With a sudden, explosive roar, Leo swept his arm across the desk. The crystal tumbler shattered against the far wall, raining glass and bourbon over the Persian rug. The monitor crashed to the floor. The heavy bronze lamp dented the oak panels. He tore the room apart with a systematic, brutal violence, destroying everything in his path until his knuckles bled and his lungs burned. When he was done, he stood in the wreckage of his office, his chest heaving, the silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. He was the king of the city, but the throne was entirely, agonizingly empty. 3 weeks, 21 days, 504 hours. Ilara sat in the sterile, brightly lit lobby of a midtown logistics corporation, waiting for her 3rd round interview. She wore a navy blazer. Her hair was pulled back. She held a sleek folder containing a resume, scrubbed completely clean of Leo Rossi. According to the paper, she had spent the last 5 years as an independent consultant for private import firms. The woman across from her, a human resources director with perfect teeth and dead eyes, smiled thinly. "So, Ilara, in your previous role, how did you handle high-pressure situations? Say, a delayed shipment that threatened a quarterly quota?" Ilara looked at the woman. She thought about a night 2 years ago when a shipment of unregistered firearms had been intercepted by a rogue Coast Guard patrol. She had woken up at 3 a.m., driven to a dilapidated warehouse in Red Hook, and calmly negotiated a $200,000 bribe in unmarked bills while two of Leo's enforcers stood behind her with shotguns. I generally prefer to preempt delays through meticulous supply chain auditing, Ilara said, her voice a flat, perfect monotone. But when unexpected issues arise, I find that direct communication and alternative routing usually solve the problem. Excellent, the HR director beamed. We love proactive synergy here. Ilara felt a wave of crushing, suffocating boredom. She got the job offer 2 hours later, a 6-figure salary, full benefits, a corner cubicle, a life of absolute, unquestionable safety. She went back to her apartment, sat on her sofa, and stared at the blank wall. It was quiet. It was so incredibly quiet. She didn't have to check a burner phone. She didn't have to calculate the profit margins of a sanitation racket. She didn't have to smell the lingering scent of dark cologne and expensive bourbon on her clothes. She had won. She had walked away, and Leo hadn't retaliated. He hadn't frozen her accounts. He hadn't sent men to her door. He had let her go. She hated it. She hated the safety. She hated the mundane, predictable rhythm of a life where the stakes were nothing more than a quarterly performance review. She realized, with a sickening jolt of self-awareness, that Leo wasn't the only one who was addicted. She had spent 5 years standing next to a hurricane. Now, standing in the calm, she realized she couldn't breathe the air. At exactly 10:40 that night, a heavy, rhythmic pounding rattled her apartment door. Ilara froze. She didn't reach for her phone. She walked quietly to the door and looked through the peephole. It wasn't Leo. It was Frank. His face was bruised. His suit jacket was torn at the shoulder, and a dark, wet stain was spreading across the lapel. Ilara unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Frank leaned heavily against the doorframe. The massive, immovable driver looked exhausted. He looked terrified. "I'm sorry to show up here, Miss Ilara," Frank rasped, his breath catching in his ribs. "Get inside," Ilara said, grabbing his good arm and hauling him into the entryway. She locked the door behind him. "You're bleeding. Sit on the chair, not the sofa." Frank collapsed into the wooden dining chair. He waved off her attempt to look at his shoulder. "It's a graze. I'm fine. I didn't come here for me." Ilara stopped. The cold pragmatism that had kept her sane for 3 weeks fractured. "Where is he?" "Safe house in the Bronx. The one under the old bakery." Frank looked up at her, his eyes desperate. "He's losing it, Ilara. Ever since you walked out, the whole structure is cracking." Carmine noticed. He saw Leo wasn't checking the ledgers. He saw he was distracted, erratic. Carmine tried to make a move tonight. A hostile takeover of the port contracts. Ilara's jaw tightened. "Carmine is an idiot. Leo will butcher him." "He did," Frank said, swallowing hard. "Carmine is dead. Half his crew is dead." But it was a mess. A sloppy, public shootout at a warehouse. 2 of our guys took hits. And Leo... Frank hesitated, looking away. "Frank," Ilara commanded, her voice turning to ice. "Tell me." He took a round in the side. Through the ribs. Frank rubbed his face with a bloody hand. "It's bad. I tried to bring the doctor down to the safe house. Leo held a gun to the doc's head and told him to get out. He won't let anyone touch him. He won't take painkillers. He's just sitting there in the dark, bleeding out, waiting for the rest of Carmine's crew to try and finish the job." Ilara stared at the driver. The image of Leo, invincible, terrifying, untouchable Leo, bleeding in a basement, rejecting help like a feral animal, twisted something deep inside her chest. "He sent you," Ilara said flatly. "He sent you to manipulate me into coming back." "No," Frank said, shaking his head violently. "No, he specifically ordered me not to come near you. He said if I brought you into this, he'd kill me himself. But I don't know what else to do. If he dies, the city burns. The Russians move in. The other families panic. It'll be a bloodbath. You're the only one who can talk to him. You're the only one he listens to." Ilara stood in the center of her quiet, safe apartment. The HR director's voice echoed in her head. Proactive synergy. She looked at her slate-gray blazer draped over the back of the sofa. She didn't grab the blazer. She walked into her bedroom and pulled a heavy black wool coat from the closet. She grabbed her keys and a dark leather tote bag from the floor. She walked back into the living room. Frank was watching her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Can you drive?" Ilara asked. "I can drive," Frank nodded, wincing as he stood up. "Take me to the Bronx." The air in the basement smelled of copper, stale dampness, and gunpowder. Ilara walked down the concrete stairs, her heels clicking softly against the grit. The heavy steel door at the bottom was slightly ajar. A single, bare bulb swung from the wire in the center of the ceiling, casting harsh, swinging shadows against the peeling paint. She pushed the door open. Leo was sitting on a ruined leather sofa in the center of the room. He was stripped to his undershirt, which was soaked through with a heavy, dark red stain on the left side. His head was tipped back against the leather, his eyes closed. A Sig Sauer 9mm rested on his thigh, his finger loosely hooked near the trigger guard. He looked pale. The sharp, predatory angles of his face were drawn and hollowed out by pain. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who had finally found a war he couldn't win. Ilara stepped fully into the room. The door clicked shut behind her. At the sound, Leo's eyes snapped open. The gun came up in a blur of motion, leveled dead at her chest. His eyes were wild, dilated, searching the shadows for a threat. It took him 2 full seconds to recognize her. When he did, the gun didn't just lower. It dropped from his hand completely, clattering against the concrete floor. Leo stared at her. His chest hitched. He looked like a man dying of thirst who had just been shown a glass of water he wasn't allowed to touch. "You aren't here," he rasped. His voice was a wreckage of gravel and exhaustion. "I'm hallucinating." Ilara walked across the room. She didn't say a word. She dropped her tote bag onto a wooden crate, opened it, and pulled out a heavy first aid kit she had forced Frank to stop and grab from the SUV. She walked over to the sofa and stood over him. Leo looked up at her, flinching slightly as if expecting a blow. "I told Frank to stay away from you." "Frank works for you." "I don't," Ilara said quietly. She knelt on the concrete floor between his knees. She reached out and grabbed the hem of his ruined, blood-soaked undershirt. "Lift your arms," she ordered. Leo didn't move. He just stared at her face, his dark eyes tracing the line of her jaw, the shape of her mouth, drinking her in like he was starving. "Why are you here, Ilara? Lift your arms." He slowly raised his arms. She pulled the shirt over his head and tossed the bloody rag aside. The wound was ugly. The bullet had torn through the flesh just above his hip bone, missing the vital organs but carving a deep, ragged channel that was still weeping dark blood. Ilara snapped on a pair of black latex gloves from the kit. She cracked a bottle of antiseptic and poured it directly onto a gauze pad. "This is going to burn," she said, her voice entirely devoid of sympathy. She pressed the soaked gauze directly into the wound. Leo's entire body went rigid. The cords of muscle in his neck stood out in sharp relief. He ground his teeth together, a low, guttural groan tearing from his throat. His massive hands shot out, gripping her hips, his fingers digging into her skin through her clothes with bruising force. He didn't push her away. He held on to her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. Ilara didn't flinch. She held the pressure steady, watching the blood soak through the white gauze. "You're sloppy, Leo," she murmured, her face inches from his chest. "Carmine shouldn't have been able to get within 10 miles of you. You let your guard down." "I was distracted," Leo breathed out, his forehead resting against her shoulder. His breath was hot and uneven against her neck. "By what?" He pulled his head back. He looked down into her eyes. The pain in his face was gone, replaced by a raw, consuming intensity that made the air in the basement feel suddenly heavy. "By the quiet," Leo whispered. The office was too quiet. The city was too quiet. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I tried to burn the whole world down to keep you, and instead I just burned myself out. He loosened his grip on her hips. His hand slid upward, his rough, blood-stained fingers trailing over her ribs, up her sides, until he cupped her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones. "I surrender," Leo said. The words were a confession, a total capitulation of his power. "I can't do it. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. I won't track you. I won't hurt anyone who looks at you. You win, Ilara. Just fix this, and then you can go." Ilara looked at the terrifying Mafia boss bleeding on a basement couch, entirely at her mercy. She had wanted to break his control. She had wanted to prove that she wasn't a pawn on his board. But looking at him now, stripped of his armor, offering her the exact freedom she had demanded, the truth finally snapped into focus. She didn't want the freedom. She didn't want the sterile cubicle, the predictable salary, the safe, boring men with their sensible sweaters. She wanted the storm. She wanted the danger. She wanted the brilliant, violent monster sitting in front of her, because she was the only one who knew how to hold his leash. He hadn't built a cage for her. They had built it for each other. Ilara taped a heavy pressure bandage over the wound. She peeled off the latex gloves and dropped them on the floor. She didn't stand up. She stayed kneeling between his legs. She reached up and grabbed the collar of his suit jacket, which was draped over the back of the sofa. She pulled him forward. Leo let himself be pulled. "I'm not going anywhere, Leo," Ilara said, her voice dropping to a dark, husky whisper. His eyes widened, the dark irises fracturing with a sudden, violent hope. "Ilara, you don't own me," she said, her fingers tightening on the fabric, pulling him closer until their mouths were inches apart. "I own you." Leo let out a shuddering breath, a ragged, desperate sound. "Yes." Ilara closed the distance. The kiss was not soft. It was a collision. It tasted like copper, salt, and absolute ruin. Leo's arms wrapped around her, pulling her up off the floor and crushing her against his uninjured side. He kissed her like a man drowning, his mouth demanding, possessive, finally claiming the one thing he had been starving for. Ilara kissed him back with equal violence, her hands buried in his dark hair, gripping him, anchoring him to her. The professional boundary, the glass wall they had maintained for 5 years, shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Leo rested his forehead against hers. His hands were shaking against her back. "You're mine," he whispered fiercely, eyes closed. "I am," Ilara agreed softly, tracing the line of his jaw. "But tomorrow morning, you are going to put a bullet in the rest of Carmine's crew. And then you're going to give me a 20% raise." Leo let out a low, rough laugh that quickly turned into a wince of pain. He opened his eyes, looking at the woman who had just claimed his empire. "Whatever you want," he said. Whatever you want, it's yours. When a monster falls in love, he doesn't bring you flowers. He brings you an empire, built on the ashes of anyone who dared to stand in the way. Elara didn't just tame Leo. She took the crown. The lines between captor and captive disappeared the moment she realized she loved the dark just as much as he did. Did she make the ultimate power move, or did she just lock herself in a cage of her own making? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this dark, intense romance, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss another twisted love story.